Hi and welcome back with another tutorial video. In this video I'll be showing you how I made the hair for these characters, and the hair are currently made with the hair cards, and it is the same technique it is used for the game models. So I'll be showing you how I am making hair planes, then I am making hair chunks from those hair planes, and finally making hair from the hair chunks. So right now, as you can see, I'm applying the hair texture on the hair plane. So I will be providing this texture, attaching this texture in the link video description, so you can download this texture and apply on your model as well. And if you want to learn how I made this texture, I will be adding a link to my other video in which I showed how I made this texture using Xgen description and splines. And I then rendered all this in Arnold and made this texture using the Arnold AOVs. For example, I rendered all the AOVs including height, AO, normal, and other stuff. So I will be adding the link to that video in the description as well, so you can just check it out and learn how to make this hair card yourself. But if you want to just make the hairs, you can just download my texture and apply it to a plane and start making hairs yourself. So for right now, I'm just tweaking my hair planes, cutting out the faces and making sure that it works correctly. And I'm closing the faces near to the hair texture because I don't want them cutting into other place when I place hair on top of each other. So that's why I'm adding edges to the faces and moving the vertices. So if you move the vertices by default, it will also stretch out the texture. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just making sure that the preserve UVs option is checked on in the tool setting for the move tool, so that when I move the texture, it doesn't messes up the UVs, it doesn't stretches or compresses the texture. So that's what I'm doing now. Right now I'm checking and making sure that when I'm working on hair, how Maya reads the alpha is very different from how the game engine reads it. So there are multiple sorting algorithms in the enter tab, which is object sorting or depth peeling. So right now I'm just checked it to depth peeling because I'm stacking shells on top of each other. So when I set it to depth peeling, I will show almost all the hair cards. So as you can see that I made the hair planes first, and then I combined those hair planes into hair chunks and made this texture, made the hair chunks, and now I'm laying out my hair chunks onto the head of my model and making the hairs. So I made hair chunks because I'm not thinking of hairs as a surface, because if you think of hair as a surface, it won't look like a volume. So I am mostly thinking of my hairs as a volume. So that's why I'm combining different planes and laying it on top of each other. So that's why when light hits the hair planes, there will be specular breakup and it will look like a volume, because there are multiple chunks of planes and there will be specular breakup. So when I'm working on the hair, I work in layers. For example, right now I'm working on the blockout layer. Afterwards I will work on the primary breakup layer, then secondary breakup layer, and then the flywest layer. There is also a layer for transitional here. I will explain each and every layer that I am working on right now. So the concept is that the blockout layer should have the most thickest hairs. There should be least transparency while working on the blockout. I mean, you shouldn't be able to see the head from the blockout layer. That's what it is. So for the so as I add layers on top of each other, the transparency is increased on each and every layer, and the hairs gets different breakup. So right now I'm working on the blockout layer, and I will add each and every layer on top of it. So while I'm stacking cards on my head, there are many things to look out for the hair, for the reference that you have. So as you can see that I am also changing thickness on some places, especially when I'm placing my hair cards near the roots. So the root angles are super important. As you can see, I have attached to reference of the root angles, and you can see that the hair root angle changes as we progress through different portion of the scalps. So right now I was working on a semi-realistic type hairs. So if you are working on a super realistic project or working on a super realistic stuff, so you should make sure that the root angle changes on each and every part of the scalp. For root angles, you can use the reference on the Google. I just search through Google and find these two references for the root angles, and you can use those references to make sure that the root angles are correct. So one other things that people mistake is they make the hair chunks a bit thicker, even for short hairs. So for short hairs, I usually don't make hair chunks, but in this project I was trying to save some time, which ultimately backfired at the end because I was spending a lot of time tweaking the hairs. So I would suggest that you shouldn't use the hair chunks for the short hairs. For longer hairs, for women's hair, you can use hair chunks because that will be very easy. So as you can see, the blocker layers look awful and ugly right now, but when I add thin hairs on top of this blocker layer, you will see that the hair gets keeps on improving, getting better and better. So in this pipeline, in the start the hair looks ugly and that is deliberate. It's not like I thought that if I place the block or layer and my hair would look super sexy, but it will gradually get better and better. So while placing the hair cards, I'm making sure that the hair cards shouldn't intersect with each other. I mean, the geometry can intersect, but I'm making sure that the texture should not cut through or intersect with each other or with other cards. So I'm making sure I keep a check on that, and I'm making sure that the hair cards are, the blocker layer is super close to the scalp, and when I'm adding the blockout layer, I'm making sure that the blockout layer has 60% of the volume of the total hair, because for fuzziness and the other stuff, it's the flyaways layer that I add later on top of the mesh. So yeah, blocker layer doesn't look good, but it is the most important layer while working on the hairs, and it will take a lot of time. As you can see, I made these hair cards a bit thicker, so I am just scaling them down to and adjusting the thickness. I usually use soft selection when moving my hair cards because it is faster for me, but if I'm working on longer hairs and wavy hairs or extremely curly hairs, then I won't be using soft selection. I would rather use the deformers for the hairs, because I learned this pipeline from Johan Litwell. I learned this pipeline from his CGMA course for hairs. I was previously working on hairs before learning from him, but most of the techniques are his. I changed some part of it when I was working on my character. For example, he used Xgen for the baking, but I sometimes just render my texture in Arnold, and sometimes I just bake it in Marmoset toolbag, because I'm using an AMD GPU, so Arnold takes a lot of time. So if I think that I don't have enough time for me, I will just bake the texture in Marmoset toolbag, because it's faster for me. And Marmoset isn't CUDA based, so it does use full power of my AMD GPU. So yeah, well, there are personal preference for it. You can just make the texture in ZBrush from fiber mesh as well, if you think that's what you want. So as you can see, I'm not adding a lot of vents. I'm just making sure that my hair guards stack on top of each other, because the only thing I'm not adding a lot of bends because I was looking for a semi-realistic type stuff, so that's why I'm not adding a lot of bends. But if you're working on a super realistic human character, so you should add a lot of bends to your hair card, otherwise it will look somewhat stylized, or maybe too smooth or too silky, like he's working in some shampoo commercial or something like that. So for realistic stuff you should add a lot of bend. And there is one more thing that I would like to tell you. For each layer, the blocker layer should have the least amount of bends on the hair cards, and as you progress through different layers of the hairs, you should increase the amount of bends or waviness. For flyaways layer, it has the most amount of bends, twists, and all the other stuff. And there is also lots of transparency on each and every hair card. For example, when I'm adding the flyaways layer, when I will be adding the flyaways layer in my in this project, you will see that there are just 3 to 4 hairs in the texture, and they will be adding a lot of detail on my character. So there's one more thing. So you can see that I will be checking my character again and again in Marmoset toolbag after every few steps, because when I'm working in Maya, sometimes the lighting is weird and it doesn't show the texture or the hair cards or their shape properly. So I check and make sure that it is proper in Marmoset toolbag. For example, you can just increase the transparency quality in your renderer tab to 1 from 0. It is by default 0.3, and you can increase it to 1, but it will still won't improve the quality that much. I'm tweaking my shader and I'm adjusting the colors to what my final look was. You could see that the before my colors were white. I start mostly with white because that's how I baked my texture. I can make it to any type of color I want. I can make it red, I can make it blonde, or anything. For red, I will change just the albedo color and the specular color on top of it, and it will give a reddish look on top of it. Even in Unreal, we mostly drive our shading information not from the albedo texture, but from the other parameters that Unreal provide in their shaders. For example, the root color or the tip color for the hair shader. So that's very important stuff. And there is one more thing that you might be thinking, that if we are stacking that much cards on top of each other, then the poly count will be increased. But that is not the case. For example, if you are viewing a character in your selection screen or in your inventory, you can just show all the layers. But for if character is in the game, you can, and the camera is very far from him, and then you should just hide the upper 2 layers, like the flyaways layer or the secondary blocker layer. You could just hide those layers, and the poly count of the hairs would be reduced to half. So that is also very important. For example, in the character selection screen, we want to show the character from super close. So we want all the hair lines and the hair fuzziness to be shown in the camera. So you can show all the layers in the character inventory selection or in the character selection screen where it's super close to the camera. And for any other place, you could just hide the upper 2 layers, and you can just use it in the game as well. So this pipeline looks at each and every aspect of the hair creation process. So that is also very important, that you can reduce the poly count of the hair to the half size and not reducing much of the quality, because you are working in layers. And there is also one more thing that is very important in this pipeline. For example, if you want to apply some simulation on the hairs, for example some wind simulation or some other simulation, then you can just apply the simulation on just the flybase layer, because the blocker doesn't have that much movement, because it's the bottommost layer while working on this process. So this pipeline also looks at that stuff, and it also makes sure that it stays optimized for you, for your character, for the game. And right now, yeah, that's what I was saying that you shouldn't use hair chunks, because for the short hairs you should just add single planes for the short hairs. I made this mistake in my judgment. I started with hair chunks because I thought he had longer hair in the front. So you shouldn't be making I would suggest you not to make hair chunks for the short hair. For the longer hair you should definitely use hair chunks, and that would make your life very easy for everything. For the short hairs, I won't recommend it, because right now it's taking a hell lot of time for covering each and every part of the scalp. So also you can see that in my blockout hair, you can see that the breakups are very sharp and the hair edges are very sharp, and you would be thinking that how this model is going to look good in the end, how you are going to make something like this into good hairs, because right now each and everything is so harsh and looks so jagged right now. So here I'm adding my primary breakup layer on top of it, and I'm making sure that the thickness is correct, making sure that the root angle is correct, and now I'm bending it according to my hair flow. So when I import it, you will see that the hairs get thinner and there is more transparency in the hair, and they will have a more softer look in the game. And just in a few seconds I will just export this thing into Marmoset toolbag, and you will see that the hairs gets more smoother and more nice and softer look. So you can see that in each and every chunk there is more transparency in the hairs, and I'm very carefully placing them on top of the blockout layer. I'm making sure that there is not much of space between them. So for realistic hair you can just increase the space and show a lot of gaps when working on it. So here you can see that the front hairs have become softer and nicer because of the primary blockout layer, and now I will just duplicate these hair cards on the rest of the head and make sure that they don't cut through each other, or they don't have some big gaps or weird cuttings going on. So for every card, because there was in some Maya's transparency is not that good, and if we increase the quality in my transparency settings to 1, it will slow down my computer. So that's what I'm looking out for, and I'm making sure that the hairs texture don't cut. Geometry can cut through each other. As you can see that on multiple occasions some of my geometry is passing through the other parts of the mesh, but that's okay because the texture is not cutting through. You can see that wherever I place the primary blockout layer, you can see that the hairs have become smoother and nicer. So you could for example in this for this piece of project, I wasn't adding a lot of breakup or a lot of bend in the primary breakup. But if you're working on a super realistic asset, you should be adding a lot of breakup, lot of root angles, lot of variation in the root angles for every hair, and you should also make that it doesn't apply directly onto the blockout layer. For example, here I'm adding directly on top of the blockout layer, and I am just making sure that I'm making sure that it stays on top of it, because I'm working on a semi-realistic hairs and not working on super realistic stuff. So that's very important to notice, because depending on the way or the art style you are going for your particular assets, that's how you are going to deform your asset. For example, if you're working on a super wavy hairs, then you are going to have a lot of bends, a lot of breakup on top of hairs. You will have a lot of fuzziness in the flyways layers, and it will be like you have a hell lot of a breakup in your flyways layers, so that the silhouette gets broken up. So right now I'm just covering my face, covering my hairs on top of the blockout layer, and I'm making sure that the blockout layer doesn't get to be seen as often, and I'm making sure that it covers all of the portion of the blockout layer. But for super realistic hairs, that's not the case. You should sometimes let the blockout layer be seen through the edges, and you can see that you can easily see where I have placed the hair, the primary breakup hairs on top of it in Marmoset toolbag. So the hair changes when you add layer and layer of multiple hairs, and it keeps on getting better and better. So yeah, very important that you look at so you shouldn't be fear that when you are working on the hairs that they are looking weird, they are looking blocky. Well, obviously they would look blocky and weird in the blockout layer, but as soon as you progress through different layers of the hair cards, it will get smoother and softer, and ultimately it will look super smooth and super realistic at the end. Well, that's true for all the art projects. For example, even if you're sculpting on a character, it will look awful in the start, because that's how art is and that's how it works. So for every art project or art assets, even if you're sculpting or even if you are working on hairs, even if you're modeling, so every art assets look awful in the start, and things start to shine with time. So you shouldn't think like my artwork looks bad in the start, and when some experienced artist works on something, his artwork looks so good. Well, obviously it looks good because he has spent enough time to make sure that it looks good. So you can see that on the places where I'm adding the primary blockout, the hairs are getting softer and nicer on each and every part of the mesh. So I will be doing the same thing, using soft selection to just move the hair into different places and adding bends and curvature to it, and I'm also making sure that it doesn't cut through each other. So that's really important. So if your hair cards are cutting through each other, it won't get a nice specular. For example, if the hair texture are cutting through each other but they are not cutting at a very bad angle, then it's okay. But if they're cutting at a very bad angle, then it will look weird when you apply specular on top of it. Also, the specular breakup is very important for the shading of the hair. So if the hair texture is cutting through each other, it will give an feeling like where this hair is ending and where this hair is starting from. So it will look weird at multiple different angles, and that won't be good for the hair asset. So you should make sure that the hair texture doesn't get cut through each other. So because I was not applying a lot of bends to this hair piece, so it was very easy for me to make sure that the hair texture is not cutting through each other apart from some of the places. But if you're working on a super realistic hair, you will have to apply a lot of time working on each and every hair card and bending it properly to shape, and you will have to take multiple steps, and and go back and forth and make sure that it's not cutting into the other hair cards. And for eyelashes and eyebrows, I will be adding those with hair cards as well, because uh, I tried to just create the texture of eyebrows, but I will be adding some flyaways layer to the eyebrows as well, because I wanted some nice and clean specular breakups on top of it. So I will be adding some multiple hair cards. I will also be adding the eyelashes with these hair cards as well, uh, because yeah, most of my time has spent in the gaming industry, so all of my techniques are you are for the gaming assets. You could use Xgen and other stuff if you want as well, because the techniques are the same. So if you make an asset look good with hair cards, then you can definitely make an asset look good with the Xgen as well, because the techniques are the same, because you have to identify how the hair are bending and how there are the breakups are going through the hair. So the process is same. For example, if a person can draw good hairs, then he can definitely make good hairs with the hair cards. He just needs to know the technical knowledge of the hairs as well. So art is the same for every asset, every piece. So if you know how to draw something, then you can definitely know how to make it in 3D. But you have to get the technical knowledge first. But if you're thinking that if you know about the tool and you will get better as an artist, then that won't be the case. You have to learn the fundamentals of art before learning the tool. You can do both of these things parallelly. So right now I was tweaking some of the hair cards I placed before, because they were creating some very bad gaps between other hair cards, and on some places they were cutting through other meshes, and there were some issues like the hair length was different on some portion. So I was tweaking the hair length on some places because it was looking a bit messy in Marmoset toolbag. So I'm going through each and every hair card on the primary breakup layer and tweaking them up on most of the hair cards, because they were generating some weird reflection weird specular breakup, and the length was uneven. So I was trying to figure that out. So I haven't talked about the transitional hairs. That is, I will be adding those hairs at the end. Well, transitional hairs are the hairs, they transition from smaller breakups to the bigger hair. For example, near the ears and near the hairline, I will be adding some transitional hairs to make sure that hair doesn't start just full blockout and full grown hair. For example, right now there are no transitional hairs, and it looks like the hairs have all the same length, and there are no transitional hairs or no short hairs on any of this mesh piece. So right now I'm adding my flyaways layers, and for this specific assets I will be covering most of my hair assets with the with this flyaways layer, but I won't recommend it. I won't recommend adding or covering the whole whole hair geometry with transitional layer with this flyaways layer, because that won't be very suitable for you. It will increase a lot of geometry for you, but you can still show it in game, because you will be hiding the flyaways layer in the in game for the character. So right now I'm checking it in Marmoset toolbag, and you can see that for every layer the hair keeps on getting better. So I will be duplicating these flyaways hairs on top of my other layers, and I will be repeating the same process over and over again. Working on hairs is a very uh, very hard and very difficult, because it takes a lot of patience while working on the hairs. So and you also don't have to worry about that it doesn't look good in the start. You just have to be patient and keep on working on it, and it will turn out good at the end. So I'll be doing the same thing. At the end I will be adding some transitional hairs, and then I will move on to the eyebrows and the eyelashes, and add those on top of my model. So because the process is the same, I will be just adding some music, and yeah. And if there is anything that needs explaining, I will jump back to the video. Okay, so thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.